Hello to everyone, and thank you for joining our last seminar for the year. I want to firstly let everyone know that it's being recorded. We like to upload them to our YouTube channel, so if you ever want to go back and see what was said, I would encourage you to. It'll be on our YouTube channel. So today we have Dr. Kenan van der Mieroop talking to us about if decolonization is enough. A short introduction is that Dr. van der Mieroop is an assistant professor at Leiden University. He did his PhD at the University of Ghent, where he researched debates about reparations for slavery in the US and France. He is also an expert in the philosophy and theory of history and has published numerous articles. And there's many more things I can say, but I will give over. And yes, we are, I think, all looking forward to hearing what you have to say. And of course, we will have some questions at the end.
Okay, thank you very much. Thanks for the generous introduction. And thanks also for this invitation. I'm honored to be invited to speak and participate among this very impressive list of speakers, and also to be able to talk about what is a very important topic, the issue of decolonization. And I also want to thank all of you in the audience who showed up to listen to this. So hopefully it will be worth your while. So now I'm going to start by trying to share my screen, which may be easier said than done. But first I'm going to play my PowerPoint, and then, oh no. I'm going to share the screen, and then I'm going to play the PowerPoint. Here we go. Can everybody see the PowerPoint? I can't see you, so you're going to have to say yes or no.
Yes. Yes.
Okay, great. Okay, well then, here it goes. So when Coca-Cola created a television advertisement in honor of Black History Month in 2007 and aired it during what is perhaps the biggest spectacle in the United States sports calendar, one with an unparalleled number of television viewers and charging the highest price for commercial spots, the Super Bowl, millions of people in America were sent a powerful message. The history of Black people in the 20th century, according to this ad, was to be viewed as a sequence of heroic achievements or African-American firsts. The viewer is presented with a timeline. Each frame juxtaposes a specific date and a location to a contemporaneous bottle of Coca-Cola and one line of text referring to an event in Black history, while blues music plays in the background. The timeline begins in 1909 at the North Pole when, quote, a black man is on top of the world. The other frames refer to the Tuskegee Airmen in 1941, Jackie Robinson breaking the baseball color line in Brooklyn in 1947, and Rosa Parks' protest on a bus in Montgomery in 1955. The timeline ends in 1963 in D.C., where a man inspires a nation to dream together. The commercial is remarkable, among other things, for the way in which it so efficiently disseminates a narrative of Black history to a large audience in a short period of time. It is, to be sure, a simplistic narrative of the type that scholars of African American history have spent years critiquing, and which relies on a periodization that has also been repeatedly challenged by historians, who have, for example, argued that for a long view of the civil rights movement. Nevertheless, it is very likely that more people had their historical consciousness affected by this 30-second video clip than by most texts on African American history published by historians. Advertising is clearly one of the most important sites. Advertising is clearly one of the most important sites of cultural production and the circulation of images in contemporary capitalism. Many billions of dollars are spent annually all over the world on an industry whose explicit goal is to convince people of something, the value of a product, the demerits of a politician, for example. In previous decades, primarily through television and more recently through other media, advertising has used image, text, and sound as a means of communication, a visual field dominated by cultural forms that are motivated by a logic of consumption is sometimes regarded as symptomatic of the current historical epoch, as part of a cultural logic of what Frederick Jameson calls late capitalism. Here we see an example of how historical knowledge is constructed in contemporary consumer society. In Jameson's postmodern era, everything is fast and ephemeral, so that history itself must be reduced to its consumability in the present. I've used a Black History Month commercial in order to illustrate a broader point about that concerns the significance of the field of all fields of history. The convergence of Black history and Coca-Cola is, in my view, typical of the new forms of consumer history that can also be found in countries across the world. The juxtaposition between the powerful cultural influence of advertising and the comparatively limited ability of historical texts written by historians to reach wide audiences raises many questions for professional historians. Among them, what kind of cultural product is the historical text in the context of the postmodern cultural dominant? In the fast-paced context of postmodernism, the historical text is a cultural product that exists alongside many other forms of cultural production. The effectiveness with which the Coca-Cola Company was able to marshal an array of representational strategies and to disseminate an account of Black history to millions of people in less than a minute stands in stark contrast to the fate of most academic historiographical texts. The latter are texts that we often think of as clear-cut scholarly works. But of course, they also continue to rely, as Hayden White has argued, on 19th century representational strategies of literary realism. What is the force of these historiographic texts that circulate in a society, as Jameson states, which is saturated by culture? In today's world of stress on the immediate and the contemporary, what is the fate of the historical text, and how does this cultural and economic context affect it? The field of philosophy of history, the field which I locate my own work in, has long been preoccupied with debating the question of historical representation, the problems of epistemology and objectivity in historical writing. However, the majority of this critique, whether it is formulated in historiographical debates or in the literature in the theory and philosophy of history, has been primarily concerned with what we could call an internal critique of the historical text. Both narrative constructivist approaches, as well as analytic philosophy of history, are primarily concerned with what goes on inside the text, or the ways in which the text is formed and formulated. Like most fields, the philosophy of history has a strong Eurocentric bias, and this fact has been pointed out by philosophers of history such as Ashish Nandi, Dipesh Chakrabarty, as well as others. For these scholars, context, geography, and colonial history play a more prominent role in their analysis of the categories of historical thought. I heard a beep. Is that addressed to me? Meanwhile, decolonial critiques of historical scholarship have very often been devoted to an internal critiques of historical texts and syllabi, even if they also pay more attention to the systemic racial inequalities that surround and condition the production of what is called historical knowledge. Nevertheless, external critiques of the context surrounding the production, distribution, and consumption of the texts are comparatively rare, or rarer than internal critiques. Hayden White's critical contribution to the philosophy of history was to propose to analyze the historical work as what it manifestly is, a verbal structure in the form of a narrative prose discourse. That's a quote. However, as we know from literary criticism and from thinkers such as Gisèle Sapiro, the context is active in the construction of the work and cannot be separated from it. As Sapiro notes, the meaning of a work is not reducible to the intention of its author, because meaning does not reside solely in the internal construction of the text, but also in the space of possible meanings whose contours are traced by the ensemble of symbolic productions from the present and the past, among which the text is situated at the moment of its production or republication. Texts relate to other cultural products in a social world shaped by class, gender, nation, ethnicity, etc. Moreover, the texts are taken up and used in a way that reflects back on the text, determining the position of the text in what Sapiro calls the hierarchy of symbolic goods. Meanwhile, the production of new texts depends on the reference to and appropriation of past texts. All of this applies as much to historiography as it does to literature. In what follows, I want to sketch the contours of a self-reflective disciplinary critique which, following the example of the sociology of literature, we might call external. Naturally, this is a large topic, and I can't go into in great detail on multiple aspects of this dynamic in a talk of this length. But I would like to use the approach drawn from cultural studies in order to argue that academic historical texts are cultural products surrounded and shaped by an economy of invention, circulation, and reception. They too are affected by the temporal compression characteristic of late capitalism and the postmodern cultural dominant. I hope to show that the success of any project to decolonize academic history will depend in part on the extent to which the external circumstances surrounding the production, distribution, and consumption of historical work can be changed. In the writing of history, Michel Desserteaux states that, like the car produced in the factory, the historical study is connected to a complex of fabrication that is both specific and collective, more than it is the product of a personal philosophy or the resurgence of a past reality. It is the product of a place. For Certeau, the study of history must be understood as a social practice that takes place in a specific locus of production. Not the factory, but the university, the archives, and the libraries are the main locations of the production of historical knowledge. If we follow Certeau's comparison, we could say that much like car factories, the loci of historical production are governed by particular economics. However, unlike the car factories which aim to produce and sell commodities for the sake of profit, the production of academic knowledge is primarily governed by different interests. We are usually told that academic institutions are interested in the pursuit of knowledge for knowledge's sake, and house individuals who, as Hermann Paul has argued, have epistemic virtues. But this is only possible, if it is at all possible, because these institutions and the scholars within them are shielded from the incessant pressure for value creation that is the norm of capitalist economies. In fact, one of the defining characteristics of academia, one thing that sets it apart from many other institutions, is that it is a space that is not primarily devoted to commodity production. Academics in general, and historians in particular, are unproductive laborers in the technical Marxian sense of that term, and in fact often depend on value produced elsewhere. If universities are to be guarantors of what Alan McGill calls disciplinary and procedural objectivity, by which he means the view that objectivity is located not in the singular historical text, but rather in the cumulative results of researchers of goodwill using a set of specific procedures like footnotes, peer review, etc., then academic procedures must not be compromised by the profit motive. This is not only because the pursuit of profit may represent a conflict of interest, but because the application of said procedures requires an enormous amount of time that no profit-seeking enterprise could justify. Capitalism is a system based on the appropriation of labor time. Academic work, however, is made possible precisely by shielding, albeit partial, of the scholarly community from the temporality of the market. In a world of rapid turnover, in which commodities are produced at ever-increasing speeds, the historical text appears as an unusual item, because it is produced and often consumed outside of this temporality. Unlike the typical commodity, the historical text is produced slowly. The time it takes to produce a scholarly work, years of research, months of writing, and time for peer review, stands in stark contrast to novels and journalistic texts. The latter are held to strict standards of concision, so that they can be consumed at speed by readers who are pressed for time and have little previous knowledge on a topic. On the other hand, the temporal freedom offered by the academic milieu permits the historical text to be formulated in what Basil Bernstein calls an elaborated code. And this is essential if they are to be a vehicle for critiquing dominant ideas. This is an important point, in my opinion, because one of the valuable things about academic history books is that they are allowed to be longer, and they give one the space to really challenge existing ideas in the way that cannot be done in an opinion piece, a newspaper, or Twitter, for example. When you have little space and time, you can't really challenge dominant ideas. And so decolonial approaches, which want to challenge dominant ideas, require time and space. In the monograph and the journal article, the historian has not only the time and space to critique existing narratives, but also to construct new ones, and indeed, to frame new debates and ask new questions. This is only possible because the production of historical texts is not fully governed by a simple market dynamic. The historical text actually exists in two different regimes of value. While it is true that the historical text does enter into circulation as a commodity to be bought and sold on the market, it also exists in the form of what Pierre Bourdieu calls symbolic capital in the academic field. Academic history is what Bourdieu calls a field because it consists of a group of specialized producers who operate in a restricted market and in a particular set of institutions. Like other Bourdieusian fields, academic historiography has its own rules and is characterized by a significant level of autotelism, in that the historical work is said to be valuable in and for itself. All of this is, of course, plays a role in determining the contents of the historical text, because the implied reader of the historical text is another insider in the historical field. The major poles of power in this field are located in the global north, and especially in the imperial metropoles. It should not be surprising that scholars in these institutions, that is to say, the holders of symbolic capital in the academic field, would be more likely to prefer and to valorize texts that engage with ideas that emanate from their own institutions and intellectual traditions. In this sense, criteria that are often used to judge the quality of scholarly work, criteria such as relevance, objectivity, and originality, would be better named relevance to so-called the Western academic or public debates, objectivity with respect to dominant ideological interpretations in these same regions, and original contributions to ongoing discussions in the metropoles of contemporary academia. Historians wishing to advance their academic careers must strive to produce work that lives up to these criteria. On the other hand, it must be said that there is a notable increase and interest in decolonial perspectives in such institutions, and this is a very welcome development. On the other hand, and perhaps not coincidentally, this comes at a time when the academic system as a whole, but the humanities in particular, has come under increasing systemic strain. As Chris Lawrence has noted in his essay in Critical Inquiry, since the 1960s, academic institutions in countries like the US, the UK, the Netherlands, and Sweden have been placed under the supervision of a new class of administrators using the techniques of new public management, which, he argues, combine a free market rhetoric with intense managerial control. This system has seen, among other things, the introduction of a class dynamic into higher education. A mass of hyper-exploited adjuncts and teachers on precarious contracts make up, according to some estimates, 70% of faculty in American universities, generating thereby the surplus which is used to sustain the increasingly bloated bureaucracy and class of permanent faculty who also have their time freed up for the production of historical texts. Managerialism in the factory aims at decreasing the level of appropriation of relative and absolute surplus value. And while Marx's labor theory of value has been subject to serious critique and has notably been abandoned by orthodox economic theory after the so-called marginal revolution, it has been energetically reaffirmed by university administrators in an effort to increase output in publications and courses taught. Whether in the hard sciences or in the humanities, publication, teaching, administrative service, and public outreach are reduced by accounting systems to homogeneous units of commensurable, or what Marx would certainly call, socially necessary labor time. The result of this system will be well known to the members of the audience. Academics in general are faced with a struggle to find time and caught in an unusual temporal conundrum. In order to produce publications, which are the primary means to obtain cultural capital in the historical field, one needs a lot of labor time. And the ability to obtain financing and to support oneself is the key to finding this time. But in order to obtain financing, one needs to obtain the necessary symbolic capital. And one of the ways in which this is done, as we all know, is through publications. All of this can only speed up and increase the cycle of the production and consumption of historical texts. There is more to write, more to read, and less time to do it in. However, this cycle is a vicious one. As managerialism speeds up historical production, it simultaneously undermines the temporal freedom that is constitutive of scholarly historical writing. It is a further example in favor of what Lawrence's thesis that the new public management's definition of education ignores the most important aspects of the education process itself, and therefore poses a fundamental threat to education. So I want to move on to the question of distribution now. What is the fate of this mass of publications? Are they widely disseminated to the masses? Of course not. Instead, historical texts are circulated to other scholars in the field of academic historiography and a small number of students, usually in the so-called West. The private publishing industry exacerbates this trend. After they are written, historical texts are freely appropriated by the private publishing industry, who are able to turn a profit on them by contributing a fraction of the cost of production. Here, academic texts become real commodities, sold on the market at increasingly high prices that make it difficult for them to be bought outside of the wealthy academic institutions in the wealthy countries of the world. It is publishers who decide which historical monographs will be widely distributed at affordable prices. They make these decisions based on what they judge the market for the book to be. As members of the audience will know, when one writes a book proposal, one is usually asked to identify the potential market. And next time you do that, ask yourself the question of where this potential market is located geographically. The high prices are sustained by monopolistic tendencies in the publishing sector. Recent research has pointed to the notable centralization in this industry, so that we can now speak of an oligopoly of academic publishers. Vincent Larivière, Stéphanie Haustein, and Philippe Mongeon have noted that just 4 publishing companies, Springer, Reed Elsevier, now Relex, Taylor and Francis, and Wiley Blackwell, accounted for more than half of academic papers published in 2013. Even if it must be said that the number is only 20% for publications in the humanities versus an astonishing 70% in the social sciences. But their strong market position allows these companies to charge large amounts for academic texts, usually to the very same universities that pay the salaries of the authors who write them. These publishing companies have their headquarters in the centers of contemporary financial and cultural power: New York, London, Oxford, and Hoboken, New Jersey. BlackRock, the American multinational investment corporation, is the largest shareholder in 3 of them. The often unpaid labor of editors and peer reviewers, upon which so many of these scientific journals rely, contributes to the profits of these multi-billion-dollar corporations. The monopolistic tendency in academia and academic publishing is not incidental. Rather, it is central to the business model of many of the most important companies. On the investor relations page of the website of Wiley, for instance, we can read that, quote, high barriers to entry are one of the reasons that you should invest with them. It is control of the information rather than its free dissemination that is in the interest of these publishers. Science Europe is currently attempting to promote open access publishing for scientific research. The UKRI also intends to follow suit. These are very welcome developments, in my opinion, even if it remains to be seen how extensive the promotion of open access publications will be. The stakes of the struggle over open access are considerable. These initiatives pose a threat to the profits of the companies just mentioned. But more importantly, as economists like Anwar Sheikh and Prabhat Patnaik and many others have pointed out, one of the main ways that the central regions of global capitalism maintain their dominant competitive position vis-à-vis the rest of the world is by guarding the rights to intellectual property. This forces countries in the global south down the value chain. The new public management techniques adopted by the universities over the last decades played into the hands of this publishing oligopoly. One of the key measures of quality in the system has been the Thomson Reuters Web of Science and the incentivization of scholars to publish journals listed in this database. Of course, most of the journals listed in that database are owned by the 4 major academic publishers I just talked about. And as Anssi Passi points out, 95% of those journals are in English. He argues that this system has led to a geopolitics of knowledge. Global academic publishing is being directed to the centers of global power in the Anglophone world. For Passi, a dynamic develops in which scholarship on the periphery is increasingly being geared towards servicing the concerns of the center. Globalized scholarship, like globalization itself, leads to a draining of knowledge from the peripheries and its concentration in the metropoles. One wonders what the net effect of scholars everywhere writing for implied readers in the English-speaking world will have on the content of current scholarship in history. To my knowledge, no empirical studies on this topic exist. but it is not a stretch to imagine that it provides an incentive to address issues of concern to audience in English-speaking academia. Historical studies of other regions may be forced to articulate their arguments in a way that addresses concerns of the academic metropole, and indeed spend a considerable amount of time simply translating concepts, categories, and debates. The scholarly duty to engage with the most important theories and works in any given field may become primarily a duty to engage with English language works in the field, leaving cutting-edge work in other languages undiscussed. It can be hard to see the deleterious effects of this system in daily practice as an academic working in a European or American institution where access to research resources is still considered to be a scholarly necessity, and where funding is set aside for this purpose. But scholars who work in other regions of the world often do not have this luxury. Imagine, for example, trying to consult an Elsevier online article on how neoliberalism has affected Amman, the capital of Jordan, while working in that city. Of course, the article would not be in Arabic, but it is in English. More disconcerting for the scholar is the fact that it is behind a $30 paywall, or 15% of a monthly Jordanian wage on average. It is thus essentially inaccessible. This is just a simple illustration of one of the plainest but often overlooked aspects of Edward Said's argument in Orientalism, that it is a discourse about the East produced in the West for Western consumption. Although academia remains a domain in which critical voices can be expressed, the concentration of the publishing industry restricts rather than enhances the ability of these messages to reach many of those groups who would stand to benefit from such insights. Now, I want to talk about reception and decoding. This brings me to the question of the reception and decoding of historical texts. What Paul Ricoeur, writing in Time and Narrative, calls mimesis 3, the moment of refiguration. The text, in this case historiographical, is received and interpreted by others. One hopes that the reader's way of understanding and being in the world, their historical consciousness, will be altered by the anagoresis of the historical narrative presented to them by the professional historian. It is hard or impossible to know how historical work is read and understood by its readers. However, we can analyze the conditions under which the reading of historical text today often occurs. Generally, the reading of historical work takes place in universities. Libraries provide the reading materials, but perhaps more importantly, students who are able to devote 4 or more years to the study have time to read. Considering the fast pace of contemporary market, this time is becoming more and more of a luxury. Outside of academic settings, such as the classroom, where teachers decide what students should read, the historical text must compete for attention of reader consumers. This is no easy task, considering the vast array of different cultural products and representations of the past that are formulated in different registers, including the Coca-Cola commercial that I referenced at the start of this talk. In this context, the historical text is at a disadvantage, not only because of its restricted circulation, but also because of its reliance on a limited array of representational strategies. Increasingly, it seems as though academic history must play the role of critiquing dominant historical narratives produced elsewhere: the movies, advertising, corporate news, and social media. In classrooms, teachers often spend as much time challenging or correcting received ideas as they do introducing new ones. Of course, scrutinizing dominant ideas is an essential part of scholarship in general and decolonial approaches in particular. But can the academic milieu produce new and culturally influential narratives, or must historians be content to write in the ironic mode? No matter what kind of history historians produce, they must contend with the fact that their audiences, the real as opposed to the implied readers of historical texts, are under certain pressures. Many of them are students at universities in the so-called global north who are inundated with information. Their visual field is saturated by cultural commodities, news articles, clickbait, and personalized advertisements, etc. Why read a history when one can simply view a video on the internet promising to explain the war in Syria in 5 minutes? 5 minutes is all the time that many readers can spare In a period during which the horizon of expectation of many individuals is increasingly one of debt repayment, the struggle to find a path into increasingly competitive labor market will often be seen as more of a pressing matter than engaging in radical critique of dominant ideas. Meanwhile, those who arguably stand to gain the most from decolonialized historiography, namely the millions, if not billions, of people in the global South who have been relegated to the ranks of the reserve army of labor for global capital, are priced out of access to historical scholarship, decolonial or otherwise. Of course, this could change with the investment in and development of educational institutions in these regions, but that might require breaking with the neoliberal models of economic management that have been advocated by institutions based in Washington, D.C. This is no simple task. So in the time remaining, I want to focus on a specific case in order to show how an external analysis of historical production can elucidate the challenges facing projects to decolonize history. The case I want to consider is the following: how to write the history of Iraq after the invasion of 2003. The question of how to write a national history of Iraq has emerged as an urgent question in a country that was divided by civil war and which is trying to reconstruct itself after the defeat of Daesh. The invasion of 2003 and the privatization of everything on neoliberal terms also harmed higher education in a country that had relatively strong state-funded educational institutions in the 20th century. After the invasion of 2003, the US government captured the archives of the Ba'ath Party and had them shift to the Hoover Institution in Stanford, California. Wissam al-Shaibi has shown in a recent and excellent article on this case that the intent was to use these archives for a strategic information campaign. The point was initially to find evidence of weapons of mass destruction, but when that failed, it shifted to trying to highlight the atrocities of the Ba'ath regime in order to retrospectively justify the failing war in that country. But who was the intended audience of this campaign? Iraqis, perhaps, but as al-Shaibi recites the Pentagon's reasoning, and this information could be used, quote, to reach audiences in the US who are hostile to the Bush administration, end quote. So last year, these archives were finally shipped back to Iraq. But more recently, in the wake of the defeat of ISIS, considerable amounts of money have been devoted to the reconstruction of Iraq. And last year, the think tank Chatham House hosted a conference intended to rethink the national history of Iraq as part of a plan to reconstruct a successful nation. These meetings took place in London and in English, and in the presence of notable Western think tanks, representatives of businesses from the region, NGOs, and notable members of the political class in Iraq. I wonder if any of the participants in that conference saw the irony in the proposal to produce a national narrative for a supposedly new and independent Iraq in the old imperial metropole that is London. Chatham House's 2002 report on Iraq's military capabilities was used by the British government to justify the invasion of that country. Scholars like Inderjeet Parmar have noted that the link between think tanks and geopolitical power. The Iraq initiative at Chatham House is funded by Crescent Petroleum, the Al-Suwaidi family, capital from the Gulf states, formerly under British control and today having tight links to the UK economy, is, as Adam Hania has shown, heavily invested in Iraq. While many of the participants of these conferences are probably well-intentioned, one wonders what history could possibly come out of this. Who is this history really for? Is it possible that institutions such as this could possibly create a national history that will empower the people of Iraq? In this case, it seems clear, at least to me, that the political and economic context surrounding the production, distribution, and reception of this history is likely to shape its content. This is also true, albeit in a different way, of academic historiography in general. Academia, scholars, students, archives, universities, scholarly works, and so on, is hardly isolated from the broader context of consumer culture and the structural imperatives of the valorization of capital that influence so many aspects of daily life around the globe. Whether the topic is African American history, Iraqi history, or any other kind of history, a decolonial approach must wrestle with the way that these structural factors shape the production, circulation, and consumption of historical knowledge. And that is it. So I hope if everybody, I'm going to stop sharing now.
Thank you so much. That was very interesting. I have to say, I really, I've enjoyed it a lot. It's a good critique of academic capitalism. We have quite a few questions in the chat. I'm not sure if you would like to read them, or I can go through and read them out. And
perhaps you could hold on. Let me just see, because I wasn't keeping track of where this all started. So can you just perhaps point me to the first question, and I'll read it aloud and try to answer it. Is it
from Wouter de Jong?
Yeah.
The first question.
Is the problem of ads dominance over academic historiography in the public understanding of history really a new issue? Or have ads and other capitalist cultural products replaced the function that popular myths and folklore have played for thousands of years? I think that's an excellent question. I think there are a lot of historians and other scholars of contemporary culture would note that while, of course, historiography or professional historical scholarship has always had to compete with other forms of representation about the past, it is we are in an age in which what I've been calling, or what Frederick Jameson calls, the visual field is positively saturated with images, music, texts in a way that is never done before. And this is something I've experienced anecdotally in my own lifetime. Now my iPhone reminds me of how many hours a day I've been on it, and I'm constantly bombarded with images and texts. Whereas I don't know if some of the younger members of the audience can remember a time in the 1990s when people were frequently bored because they had nothing to do and they were at home, right? So maybe they would have gone out, or they would have gone to the movies, or something like that. But I think the power of, for example, Coca-Cola to reach really millions of people, and you can study this. I mean, that's one of the fascinating things about studying advertising. We don't know, or when I publish an article, probably I'm not the best representative, but even the most influential historians, when they publish an article, the most influential text on African-American history will be read hopefully by millions of people. But the Super Bowl advertisement in 30 seconds reached many millions of people. So I think that the mechanics of that are new, and they have to do with, there's a very large question of scale, which has become, in my opinion, more than just a question of scale, but also a question of quality. So I hope that answers the question. And probably I could spend the rest of the time talking about that very interesting question, but I also want to get to the other questions. I guess Frank has asked, I find it difficult to disentangle debates about capitalism and decolonization. Are these the same thing? I myself don't know, because I don't think, in my understanding of decolonization, of course, you have theories or a school, working on the work of Mignolo and Quijano and people like that. That might be a more strict definition of decolonial. I think the broad calls for decolonization are certainly often bound up in a critique, a broader critique of the dynamics of capitalism. I would certainly not say that what I'm doing here is different to a decolonial approach. It's only a plea for more focus, if you like. I mean, I think it's a modest proposal for more focus on these other aspects, and there are many people already working on that, and I just would like to be one of them in this particular case. So I hope that answers your question. I suppose feel free to interrupt me if not. Should academics adopt a capitalist mindset when dealing with publishing companies? I think that, there's a question about what ethically or strategically one wants to do. And I think that if you do that, you have to take into account the situation in which you're working. So, I think it's very difficult as an individual to say, well, I'm going to publish all my things in open access, and I'm going to just write, for example, I'm going to write a history of Iraq in Arabic for the Iraqi public. Well, do that. That's great. But good luck getting tenure in America, right? So I'm not, so perhaps you can do that and do other things. But I'm saying that, this is something that, one has to approach in a collective way. And the people who are mobilizing around decolonial issues are working in a collective way. So that's a good thing, in my opinion. So I guess that's what I'm trying to get at. Andre asks, and I hope everyone doesn't mind me using their first names, how can academics counter capitalist publishing practices? Well, I think that I don't have the answer entirely to that question. I think a lot of people sort of surreptitiously do it already by putting things on academia, circulating things to students who are interested, making a point of going to, let's say, teach abroad outside of the centers of the usual centers of global academia. Many people, including people in this group, have clearly gone abroad, and so that's a good initiative. And of course, public outreach in the form of activities that the Utrecht Decolonisation Group is doing could be an example of that kind of thing. So I think that there are a lot of people with more interesting ideas than I have. So I hope that answers that question. Then a lot of us circulate text. Oh, okay. So Rachel has then answered the question. So let me see here.
Sorry.
Okay, I think that's all the questions. Maybe I've gone through them too fast. So
I have a question if you have time to answer it.
Yes, of course. Yeah.
Is that okay, Hannah?
Yes, I was also going to ask a question. I'll go next.
It's more of a request for Kenan to reflect or perhaps differentiate, because I completely agree with what your brilliant outline of the value of slow books. Right, books are slow, and I have never thought about the way of describing the labor of a historical book the way you described it. So thank you for that. At the same time, there are other scholarly functions for Twitter. Of course, I would say that I'm a big Twitter user, but the one thing I have seen is that it in fact provides solidarity in the face of the kinds of structures you've so brilliantly critiqued. And it has also provided a way around academic gatekeeping for Black scholars and a way of amplifying their voices. In particular, this is something I've seen a fair amount on what is popularly called Black Twitter, is that it enables people to get a perspective out there that has not always had other ways of getting through. So I don't know how you feel about that tension, or whether that's a different talk, placing that in the context of the kind of slow labor practices that you were describing.
I think that's really interesting, and thanks for asking that. I'm certainly not against Twitter, and I certainly don't want to say we should only do slow books and not engage in other forms of media. But I do think, and I'm not an expert on Twitter because I'm not on Twitter myself, so you probably know a lot more about it than I do. What I would say, though, is that one of the things that separates academic work from other types of work is precisely that, this temporal dynamic that I try to explain. And even on Twitter, one of the things that one can get value out of on Twitter is being directed to longer works, right? And then I think the other thing that's so interesting about contemporary debate and on Twitter, and this is a very subjective view that I perhaps have, I'm sure there are studies of this, but it does lead seemingly to a lot of silo effects. So one of the frustrations is though that a lot of people who are reading very interesting work have discussions amongst themselves, and when I hear a lot of things on YouTube or on Twitter about the, left-wing hegemony of the mainstream media, who is forcing us to do all sorts of things, etc., I'm, always struck by, let's say, the fact that it's quite clear that they haven't read anything, that, they don't have the time or the patience to read anything that serious that's being said. So it's much easier to critique a tweet which is sort of taken out of context and said to be representative of a whole movement like decolonial, for example, the decolonial practices, rather than actually engaging with book-length interventions by scholars who've been writing on this issue since the 70s, 80s, 90s, right? and many of the sort of issues. I mean, right now, Twitter is often illuminated by discussions. Explodes with discussions of the supposed excesses of, identity politics and so on. And in the 1990s, these debates were seriously reflected upon, by a whole range of scholars, mostly from the left, right? And it's just totally ignored. I mean, so, yeah, I mean, how does one deal with that? I mean, I think one of the reasons for that is because it's hard to get a hold of this scholarship, but it's also hard for a lot of people to find the time to read it. And our students and we ourselves are lucky to have that time and space, even though we feel that it's under constant, I don't want to sound melodramatic here, but constant attack from these other pressures, right?
I was about to say attack, so you've got an amen up in here, but yeah.
Yeah. Well, I guess I'm preaching to the converted, but, or I hope I'm preaching to the converted, but, yeah. So,
there's another question in the chat.
Yeah. It's from Giacomo. Giacomo has a question. The topic is language. To what extent is language a limit to decolonizing academia? We all know the pressures that the global use of English puts on non-native speakers, and we are aware of the economic problems of accessibility to English universities that many students around the world face. This creates problems for publishing as well, like the very long times for peer review often show. Meanwhile, academia does not, I've lost my place here. Meanwhile, academia does not have any services for making English as a global language more democratic, like translating offices, for example. I think this is a really, interesting question. On the one hand, there are also advantages to English. The fact that everybody can now speak English. I mean, if you want to create sort of global solidarities, it's very useful to be able to speak in English. But Giacomo, I know you're a student of mine. You're from Italy. Italy is an example. I mean, this is something that the periphery, if you like, or the semi-periphery of academia is also in Europe, right? Countries like France and I did my PhD in Belgium and so on. But, our people there constantly complain of having to valorize their work in the English-speaking world. So, if you're a philosopher writing on, phenomenology, there's a great tradition of that in France. Why should you publish in the British Journal of Phenomenology? Well, because, increasingly your academic career is advanced by this. German German language scholarship has gone further than French language scholarship, and the French are often mocked for being steadfastly attached to the French language. I personally think, why shouldn't they be? And more than that, I mean, the example I used of Iraq is interesting to me. A lot of good work or a lot of work is just being published in English, and then that's what I tried to basically point out. A lot of this just ends up translating ideas, translating either sources from Arabic in the literal sense, or what they're doing is they're trying to address what I've been calling an implied reader in the West. So that means it has to be relevant to Western concerns. The question of objectivity is determined with reference to Western debates about objectivity. Now, your question is, there are no structural accommodations for this, and I understand that. I mean, that would probably be, you could say on the one hand, there should be structural accommodations for this, and probably the Netherlands might be an example of a country that tries in some way to do that. But on the other hand, is it not an interesting idea to entertain that countries in the global South should precisely not invest in that, but instead invest in circulation of academic stuff, academic ideas to their own to their own market. I mean, they even want to get away from the market. The free dissemination of scholarly ideas to their own regions. And that is something that, you just need resources to do it. It's not that these countries have not tried at certain points to do this. It's that it's proved very challenging to do so, especially when economic conditions of austerity are imposed upon them. I mean, you've seen the consequences of this in Italy, in Greece as well. Well, I mean, a lot of people have pointed out that this is, this has been going on in the global south for a very long time. So, okay, you have other areas in the global south. You have, a lot of institutions springing up in the Gulf states, but what class of people in the global south is if you can call it the global south, because this is, as Adam Hania points out, a region which generates trillions of dollars. It's a central node of the contemporary economy. So is this really like a democratization of academia? Is basically my point. I think the class dynamic is really important to take to look at, because one of the risks one runs is by welcoming academics also from the third world into the places like the United States is, okay, that's great, and that's great for these areas, but there's a brain drain in a lot of these countries. So, but there's no easy answer that I can offer to that problem. It's just so yes, it's in a sense it's a frustrating analysis because I don't have the answers. So I hope that answers your question, though. Thanks. And then I see. Yes, Walter has asked, where would you place authors like Yuval Harari, whose work *Sapiens* is a global success, or maybe only in the global north? I think that one of the interesting things about that book is that it's considered precisely not to be a scholarly book by academic historians. Not that this guy is not a serious historian, he is. But what he's doing is he's playing an intermediate role. There's a lot of space for intermediate cultural producers. And what he does is he takes ideas that have been around in academia for a very long time, and he presents them to a wider audience, which is great. In a sense, we need that. And so, I'm not saying that that's not necessarily a good thing. I'm not familiar enough. I read the book a while ago. I can't engage in a sort of critique in the vision of sort of global history or the history of humankind that it presents. But I'm sure that if you would really study it, you would find that it is, let's say, playing to some of the interests or concerns of a readership in the West. And if you look at where the books were initially marketed, probably they were marketed in places like the United States. I know Obama read it. And I recall that, upon reading it, that certain things struck me as relevant to contemporary concerns, concerns as banal as dieting. People obviously in wealthy countries are very concerned with what kind of diet one should eat. And Hariri points out that hunter-gatherers had a better diet than people who were engaged in agriculture and consuming wheat. So that might be surprising. What I thought was that sounded like it was a great thing to hear for those anti-gluten advocates. But perhaps I'm speculating a little bit too much. But so anyway, I think that type of dynamic goes on. So I hope that answers your question. So G Lara asks or comments. Just a comment on how to decolonize knowledge dissemination for scholars from the West, global North to teach abroad. This is a usual mindset among American European academics, as if scholars in the global South lack expertise and knowledge to teach themselves. A lot of local scholars are displaced in the academia because local unis have also this colonial mentality that scholars are abroad are better trained. Yeah, I think that's a good point. There is a lot of stuff going on. There is a lot of excellent work going on in the global South. I'm certainly not saying that should stop or that the work that is being produced in the global North is better. On the contrary, but I am interested in the fact that a lot of people in the global North are talking about decolonization. So presumably this is of interest also. And, for example, the article I mentioned about neoliberalism, if you're in Jordan and there's an article about neoliberalism in Jordan and it's produced by a professor at Ghent University and it's under a $30 paywall, well, I think that must be frustrating. I mean, you might want to read that. So that's all I'm asking about. That's all I'm talking about. Meanwhile, there's the other issue of things like archives. So if you want to write a history on Iraq under the Ba'ath period until recently, you would have had to go to Stanford, California, and you wouldn't have gotten a visa as an Iraqi academic to do so. So you have to face that reality. I guess the question is, how do we move forward? Yeah, I think I've tried to sort of suggest some answers to that, but without being able to formulate a sort of program about how that can broadly be done. I think it is, as the previous question alluded to, it is being done by a lot of small, unknown, or sometimes big, but unknown in the West groups in the global South. So that's a good thing. And I think, as I was mentioning, initiatives like this one could be part of that. And I think that, so I think we need to embrace those and provide a sort of economic structure or context or support system that's more conducive to that, and work in sort of some solidary way with other groups around the world as much as possible. Things like supporting open access, as simple as that. I guess that's it.
Yeah. If there are any more questions, if anyone has any comments, please just feel free to turn your mic on and speak. But I have to say, I thought that was very interesting. I come from South Africa myself, and I studied in the Netherlands since my bachelor's. Now I'm doing a master's, and I really have no intention of moving back to South Africa or ever entering an institution there. And it's challenging. But also I remember when I first decided to come study here, it was such a huge thing. It was amazing. It was, oh my goodness, this is the greatest decision you could have made. I also could have gone to the University of Cape Town, which is a much bigger university name than where I did my bachelor's. So I guess it's all a bit challenging. And I think that it is very true that we have a tendency to look down. Yeah. Okay.
That's very interesting personal story. I think a lot of the people present probably have similar things. I see some mouths moving. I don't know if they're talking to us or if they're...
Frank, are you talking to us or...
Sorry. My life is a mess. That's the I'm good. No.
Good. Okay. Actually, sorry, is it Kenan or Kenan? How do I pronounce your name?
You can say Kenan, that's fine.
Kenan, you covered such a lot of ground, and I know we're recording this, but do you have some and I know I can look on your biography, but do you have an article you would particularly point us to, or something that summarized some of this that we could go and read slowly and in a complex and kind of thoughtful fashion?
Well, I'm at the moment in the process of converting part of what I've said to an article for the journal Rethinking History. So it's been accepted, but I need to add a lot to it, partially because one of, some of the comments of the reviewers is that I need examples and so on. One of the things is that when I'm making this argument about a plea for an external, what I'm calling an external critique, is because my previous stuff has been really internal. So if you look at what I have published in, for example, History and Theory or Rethinking History, I talk about how, for example, African American history has been presented. But there's very much an internal critique. The problem with the external critique and the Bourdieusian approach that I'm advocating is that it requires often a sort of quantitative and empirical approach, which I am, as an individual, not at this point capable of carrying out completely. But that being said, if you want me to send around what I've just written to you, what I've just read off to you, then I'd be happy to do so. And I'd be more than happy if you would have any comments or helpful feedback that I could incorporate.
Yeah, there was just a tremendous number of useful names, and some of them familiar, and some of them new, and so I think some of us would benefit from it anyway. I guess if we have time, a name I didn't hear, but I've heard kind of talked about when it comes to critiques of capitalism, but maybe as one of these older thinkers that you talked about from the 60s and 70s, is Cedric Robinson. And I have to admit, I have not read it. So, but is that something that is germane to your analysis, or is it sort of passé now?
Well, I don't think Cedric Robinson's work is considered passé. On the contrary, it seems like it's been a sort of renewed interest in it. As that's the idea that I get, especially because of the link between race and capitalism, is one that's received. Well, I mean, it's always been talked about, but it's become increasingly in the United States in a new way, in a new, more popular way, a question of debate. And I personally think. Cedric Robinson's argument along those lines to me seems relatively convincing about the way that capitalism emerged side by side with strategies of essentially othering not only towards the global south, but he also starts off talking about, for example, Ireland. So I think that although I'm far from being an expert in Cedric Robinson's work, I think it's really very interesting, and I would look for an excuse to try and use it or reference it, if at all possible, in the future. But I'm not familiar enough with it at the moment to be able to incorporate it, at least into this analysis.
If there are no more questions or comments, then we can wrap up. And I will say thank you so much. That was very, very, very interesting, and I think a really good ending to our series for the year. Thinking further beyond even just these categories. So thank you so much, and yes, we will. There is actually one more question in the chat I just saw. That just popped up.
Oh, okay. Well, I guess. Hold on. Because I haven't been checking the chat. I see a lot of thank yous. Also from former students. Oh, yes. What do you think of projects that try to place history in the very long-term perspective? Like Gouldy and Armitage's History Manifesto, which is advocating for historians to engage with a deep history perspective. I think that gauging in a perspective, long or short term, doesn't necessarily determine the content of the historiography. So, I mean, that's the short answer. Everything depends on the ideological implication and of the work, and so I think that has to be judged more on a case by case basis. The History Manifesto, I think now in the past I had read a lot about it, but I'm afraid I can't recall enough of what the nature of their call in that manifesto was in order to be able to comment on it right now, which I regret, because in the past I had read a lot about it, so I've just forgot. So I'm sorry for that. Okay, well, if there are no more questions, then I'm very grateful to all these people who showed up. It's really kind of you. And I hope that we can continue. Well, I'd like to extend to those people who are there. If anybody is interested in getting in touch, this would be the moment, I suppose, if we were not on Teams, to be able to go to the cafe and continue in a more informal manner. But I think it's for the best, considering the COVID restrictions, and that one of our party has been struck down with COVID to avoid that. So I wish you all good health, and hopefully we'll see each other again, or for the first time, in the near future.
Yes, thank you so much, and thank you everyone who joined. And yeah, bye.
Thank you. Thanks, guys. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.